Thank you all for coming to our one of our last remaining sessions of the AngelNV Entrepreneurs Bootcamp. We're very excited to have you here, and Happy New Year to everyone. Hope you had a wonderful set of holidays. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker here, Leith Martin, in just a moment, as well as talk about our upcoming sessions. I do first want to talk about the AngelNV Entrepreneurs Bootcamp. For those of you that do not know, we're very excited to be able to bring this program to bear to teach founders a little bit about Startup 101, and a lot about raising capital 101. So how this process has worked and will continue to work next year and for the remainder of this session is we work to bring knowledge and education resources to Nevada-based founders and startups. And we do this through a two-sided, we do this for the entrepreneurs in a 15-week, 13-session boot camp, where we run founders through a series of course sessions about the things that I just mentioned, raising capital 101 and a little bit of entrepreneurship. Everything from pitch decks 101, market research, intro to speaking to and engaging with investors, all the way to investment due diligence and deal terminology and term sheets. On the other end of this program, we also have a program for investors, whereby we take dozens of accredited investors who are interested in investing in startups, particularly Nevada-based startups, and we run them through a boot camp, if you will, sessions on everything from how to invest in startups, how to conduct due diligence, how to make good assessments and engage with founders of the various ventures in their own ecosystem. And at the edge of this, we're going to have a big event, the AngelNV Pitch Conference, whereby one of the founders that is registered to, maybe one of the ventures in this room attending these sessions now, will register to be able to pitch in front of this group of angels for an opportunity to get an investment of $400,000 to the top startup, to the top Nevada startup. So it's really exciting. And the reason we can bring this to bear is through the SSBCI program, or State Small Business Credit Initiative, in partnership with the Governor's Office of Economic Development. We're very lucky and very privileged and very happy to be partnered with GoEd in this endeavor to bring more capital to and resources to Nevada-based startups. With this program, the state matches investments made by Startup NV. So whereby we will be investing $200,000 to the top startup in the end of this program at the AngelNV Investor Pitch Conference. And the state will match that investment for a total of $400,000, which is very exciting. And there's opportunities for other match funding through our investment programs and other groups in the state. So we're very excited for this. And it's been a really fruitful and exciting program to bring to bear in Nevada. Tonight,
so let me ask you a question.
Yes.
On the 400K and the 400 matching, obviously the 400 from Startup NV is equity based.
200K.
Okay, 200. Okay, so are both equity based?
Both are equity based. The state will be making an investment in these startups. It will not be a grant funded. That's a good question. I appreciate it. Without further ado, what was that, Maggie?
They match our terms.
That's right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. They match our terms. It's my privilege and a pleasure to introduce Leith Martin. He's the executive director of the Troche Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Lee Business School here at UNLV. He oversees a number of the innovation entrepreneurship programs there, and the Rebel Venture Fund, a student-run venture investment group out of the UNLV. Leith has background where he received a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of Alabama, where he's from that area, and he went on to pursue an MBA also from the University of Alabama. After he graduated, he had a number of offers from several Fortune 100 companies, but he decided to instead pursue an entrepreneurial route, and he got involved in Turnip Seed International, which at the time only had 2 employees. He bought stock in the company, took over as president in 1999, and during his tenure at Turnip Seed, he expanded its operation into India and Mexico, and on average grew the company 100% for over 8 years. In 2007, Leith was admitted to the Owners and Presidents Managers program at Harvard Business School. The OPM program by the Harvard Business School was specifically designed for entrepreneurs. He relocated to Las Vegas in 2010 and co-founded Equinet, a technology company that has customers across the United States as well as in China and Western Europe. And today we're going to have him talk to us a lot about engaging in the due diligence process. So when an investment group or a single investor has decided they want to consider investment in your venture, how to prepare and what to expect during that, what we call a due diligence process. But I do first want to speak to our coming up speakers. We will have Craig Macy, who will talk about term sheets and investment terminology. So once you've gone through due diligence, which Leith will speak on, what are the terms and terminology, the things you need to know about the actual investment offer and what the various components of a deal look like and what their definitions are. So it's a really important session for folks out there that are thinking about or already raising capital or intending to raise capital. And after that, we will have our final session, which will be the pitch, practice, and deconstruction. It'll be the final one of the year. So come prepared, put yourself out there and be ready to pitch and get some critical and live feedback. We are proudly sponsored and supported by GUST. GUST is a program that we are going to be using for these for the pitch session, the pitch conference. GUST is a global SaaS platform for founding, operating, and investing in scalable and high growth companies. GUST has various online tools to help entrepreneurs start, run, and fundraise for companies that provide deal flow and relationship management for investors as well. So we're pretty excited to be partnered with them this year as we continue forward with the AngelNV program. Please, this would not be possible without the support of our community and our ecosystem and the work that we're doing here. So if you are already not following or engaging with us, please join, follow, like, share, engage with us. Is by community help and mandate engagement that we continue these programs and continue to develop an ecosystem here.
All right, well, I'm not going to add much in terms of introduction after that introduction by Logan. I think he's covered everything. I have to kudos to Logan. Benjamin is here. Benjamin is currently a student at UNLV in a Master's of Finance program. Yes, Master's of Finance program. He's also a member of the Rebel Venture Fund, who Logan referenced. Logan was actually a director of the Rebel Venture Fund at one point before he got involved at Startup NV. So we've got lots of our students scattered across the valley here working on different deals one way or another. As Logan mentioned, I'm going to talk about due diligence, and the way I'm going to do it is a little bit counterintuitive, I guess, in some ways. I'm going to use the same deck that I use when I do a due diligence presentation to investors, meaning I'm teaching investors about due diligence and why they should want to do it, because I think it makes you as an entrepreneur a little more empathetic, understanding why it's so important for investors to actually do the due diligence itself. Now, we'll talk back and forth about the different perspectives on why it's advantageous or what you should consider in terms of the investor side versus your side. But the reality is that this is part of the process. While it can be incredibly tedious at times for some entrepreneurs, trust me, it's just as tedious for the investor oftentimes. So keep that in mind. I'll be pounding for the next 45 minutes to an hour. I'll be pounding cough drops and water. I was sick last week. I almost lost my voice. This is my 4th or 5th hour of presentations today. So I'm trying to hang in there and make sure I don't lose it, because I thought I was going to lose it about 2 o'clock today, but it hung in. So we're good to go. All right, so let's talk about due diligence. So before we dive into the due diligence portion of it, give me some reasons why startups fail. Why do startups fail? Give me some reasons. Don't be shy. Yep.
Funding environment.
They don't have enough money, right? What else? Not a good enough idea. Yep. Bad management. Yep. Sure. What else?
Take it to market.
Okay. What else? Okay. They don't have product market fit, right? Cool. What else?
Team.
Just a bad team, right? Any other ideas?
Dedication,
just not committed, or not, or maybe in the front end, not understanding what the level commit was going to be necessary. And then when it came time to do it, weren't willing to do it, right? Any other ideas why a startup might fail? Okay. So competition, right? So either they misevaluated what the competition was doing or could do, or maybe the competition just killed them right out of the gate, right? Any other ideas? Regulation. Okay. Intellectual property issues. Maybe they've infringed at a patent right out of the gate and got killed right out of the gate, right?
Just bad luck.
I'm sorry?
Just bad luck.
Bad luck, right? It's happened a few times. I've seen it myself and participated in the bad luck myself, right? Yep, market timing. Bad press? Usually as a result of something else, but yes, definitely bad press could be part of that as well.
Bad investors.
Bad investors. It's happened. I've seen investors try to take over a company and ultimately kill the company. Right? I've seen it multiple times as well. This is what I will say just right out of the gate. If you're struggling to get along with an investor in the really early stage of the investment process and you're working through due diligence and you're like, man, this is a nightmare. This is the honeymoon phase. If you can't get along during the due diligence in the really early stage, they want you to take their money and you want to take their money and you're still not getting along, don't marry them because it's going to go bad once you get married. I can promise you that. All right. So there's lots of reasons that startups fail. And there's a guy named Bill Gross who basically founded the Idea Lab. He's got a great TED talk on why businesses fail or why startups fail. And he basically said it came down to 5 things that he could figure out. Everything else he felt like you could put into a subcategory of these 5 things. And those 5 things were market timing, the business model, the team, funding, and the idea. Those were his 5 that he came up with, right? And then what he did is he went and ranked hundreds of companies that he'd been involved with through the Idea Lab and hundreds of companies that he'd involved as a board member or whatever it may be. And he ranked all of those companies based on those 5 criteria. And what he determined relatively unscientifically, but based on experience, was that the number one reason that companies fail was market timing. Market timing was wrong, right? The number 2 reason they fail is the team. Right. Now, so inside that team, it could be bad management, but it could be the team fell apart because of personality issues. It could be lots of reasons, but the team, all right? A really good team could overcome lots of bad things, but a really bad team couldn't overcome anything, right? And then the third thing was the idea, and his concept was you can't have a bad idea, but the reality is if you have a good team and you can figure out what market timing is available, then you can make adjustments or pivots based on that. The third thing was the business model in terms of importance, and the last thing was funding. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've met a ton of founders that have failed because they didn't have funding. Or they say they didn't have funding, or they couldn't get funding, or they can't get investors. The reality is if you can't find investors after 6 months or after a year, the problem is not the investor. Look in the mirror. Something's wrong. Either something's wrong with the opportunity or something's wrong with you, but it's probably not the investors, okay? So if companies say they failed because they ran out of money, if it's a compelling opportunity, investors want to give you their money because they want to make money. And so if it's a compelling opportunity, they really believe in the team, they know they can pull it off, they're going to give you your money, right? They're going to figure out a way to work it out. All right, so this is the process by which you figure out whether or not the investor wants to give you the money, right? So this is the due diligence process. So the official definition is the investigation or analysis the investor performs to ensure an investment opportunity meets the criteria for funding. The primary objective is to mitigate investment risk by understanding the company and its business. If you think about an investment that you may want to make in a publicly traded company, there's lots of public information, right? That's mandated by the SEC. So you can go online and you can find all the regulatory filings, you can find all the information they put in the press, you can find all these different things. And they're somewhat, with some exceptions, I guess, they're somewhat accurate. And the reason they are is because if there's fraud involved, they can go to jail, right? And so they're making their best to do that. The reality is, in the world of startups, there is no public market, right? And so there has to be this give and take where the process is worked out, where they're trying to figure out whether or not they want to invest in your company. And that's what this is. This is more than likely after you've done the pitch, you've stood up and you said, this is who I am. This is how great my company is. I've only put good things on the slide because I don't want to talk about the bad things. Their goal in the due diligence process is to go figure out what the bad things are. And then figure out whether or not they can justify or get over the bad things, or if those bad things are bad enough that they're not going to give you an investment. All right. So that's what this process looks like. Now, why is it important for a company to do due diligence? Well, the reality is, if you look at the probability here, if they're 90% capable in terms of management of pulling it off, or the market demand is as expected to the degree of 90%, and go on down the list, the competition and all this other stuff can be held at bay with IP, the company has sufficient capital, the liability and litigation is avoided, blah, 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 blah. If each one of those categories is 90% probability that you are correct, then there's only a 48% chance the company is going to be successful. right? So the reality is a startup is more likely to fail than it is to succeed. But the truth is you've got to weed through this stuff and make sure that you're comfortable with all these different variables before you make the investment. If one of these numbers falls to 50%, there's a 27% probability the company will be successful, right? Now that's if you went down the list of things that you thought was really good and you put 9 out of 10 on every one of those line items, right? So that's why due diligence is incredibly important. If you don't do it, probably miss something. All right. So when should a company or an investor do due diligence? And if they ask you about doing due diligence or engaging you in due diligence, my hope would be that these type criteria would be met by the investor. One is that it meets their industry, because some investors only invest in certain types of businesses. I only invest in telecom. I only invest in SaaS. I only invest in hardware. Good luck finding the one that only invests in hardware, right? Not a ton of them. There are some, and the reality is they're paying great prices on valuation because they don't have to stand in line with everyone else at the SaaS line, right? So are they pre or post revenue? Because some companies don't, some investors won't invest in pre-revenue companies. Is it a compelling opportunity? Can you get me out in 5 years, right? Do they see a foreseeable exit in 5 years or less? Does it have strong management? Whatever the investing criteria are that the investors set for themselves in their fund, if those criteria are met, then theoretically they should want to engage in due diligence with the startup to figure out whether or not they want to make an investment. I've seen investors use this as the reason to engage in due diligence. Everyone else in the room I didn't like, so this is the only one left. So that's one I'll talk to about doing the due diligence with. Or I have a little more money before the end of the year. I need to find a company to put it in, right? That's like being the last one at the party. Everyone's drunk. Everyone else has gone home. And you're just like, well, I don't really know. There's nobody else here. So I need to find out someone to go home with, right? So you have to be incredibly careful. Even with the investors that you deal with, they have to make sure that you are a good fit for them as well, right? All right. So how does this due diligence process work, right? So there's lots of different ways. There are lots of different kinds of investors. So there are lots of different ways in which they do due diligence. Sometimes what happens is that the lead investor or the person that's going to lead the round and negotiate the term sheet is going to basically do the due diligence, and they're going to provide a due diligence package to the other potential investors. So sometimes as the company, you might be able to work with the lead investor. They go through their whole due diligence sheet with you or their correct list or whatever, and then they write up a report and they say, yeah, we've done a report. If anybody else wants access to due diligence, you can refer them to us and we'll send them our report. Now that could be very valuable to you as the entrepreneur, because that means if you're trying to raise $1 million and you've raised $100,000 from your $250,000 from your lead investor, and all of these other investors are going to come in behind that on the same term sheet, that means that hopefully by providing them, the lead investor, by providing them the due diligence sheet that they've done or the report that they've done, that mitigates some of the questions that you have to answer for all of those other investors that might invest in this particular round. Okay. So sometimes that's what happened. The lead investor leads the due diligence. They provide a due diligence report to everyone else. It answers the vast majority of questions I may have because I'm the 4th or 5th investor on the list. And then I may ask you just 1 or 2 questions to clarify some things I didn't understand in the due diligence report, right? So that's sometimes how it works. And they might share that due diligence package. Sometimes if you're dealing with an angel group of some kind, they have a committee, right? So you come, you pitch in front of the angel group. They say, we vote. We think we should take them to due diligence. We like the company. Then they put you in contact with the head of the due diligence committee. And then they start working with you as the founder or the entrepreneur to figure out whether or not they should make an investment. Sometimes an outside law firm is hired. I've seen that done as well. Sometimes, keep in mind that this is a 2-way due diligence process. As I mentioned before, if during the honeymoon phase of this relationship, things are rocky, definitely don't marry them, because the reality is it gets really bad when you take their money and things aren't going well. All right. So this is a 2-way process. You should be, I'm not going to say you're going to go do a great deal of interviewing, but the reality is you should call some people they've also invested in, some other companies, and find out what kind of investor they are. Are they in my office every week? Do they send me 10,000 emails a week? What's the relationship between you and their other portfolio companies? You might want to know that. So you have a better understanding of what they are, what kind of investor they are. Some groups hire professional firms or consultants to do their due diligence. I think that's a little weird. And here's the reason I say it's a little weird. So let's say I'm going to start a company and I hire, let's throw one of my students. I hire a student at UNLV to write my business plan. Well, okay, let's go hire the cheapest person on the market to write my business plan. Oh, by the way, they've probably only written one, and it was probably for a class. And let's go hire them and put my entire life on the line with the business plan that they wrote, right? It's like the entrepreneur who wants to outsource their business plan. The reality is the investor who wants to outsource through due diligence, that's a little risky for me, right? So for me, I'm always a little uncomfortable if investors are going to outsource their entire due diligence process. Sometimes the investor does it himself. They do all the meetings. They go by the office and ask questions. They do all of those kind of things. All right, the next question is, this is a big one. As an investor, should the investor expect to sign an NDA? What do you guys think? Yeah. There's zero chance the investor will sign an NDA. They will not sign it. I will not sign it. I would never sign it as an investor. I would never sign an NDA. Now, in some cases, okay, you might be able to say, well, there's some proprietary stuff. We want to take it to the next level, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is we all think we're special. I remember my brother-in-law, who was a medical student and had a small child, and I'll never forget this story. He said he took his son to the pediatrician, and there was I don't even know what the symptoms were. And my brother-in-law was like, well, maybe he has whatever, Amazon such and such fever, right? Really rare. And I remember he said, I'll never forget the doctor, the pediatrician said, look, you're not that special, right? The reality is there's 10 things we can go through before we get to that, right? You might have it, probably not. The reality is you might think that you're the special company that gets someone to sign an NDA, but you're probably not, right? And so an investor's not willing to sign an NDA for lots of reasons. One is, what if they see another deal in the market that, quite frankly, is better than you, and now they can't even engage with them or make an investment in that company because they put under NDA with you, right? There's lots of reasons why they might not want to do that. The reality is there's dozens of companies that won't make them sign an NDA, so why should I sign one just to do a deal with you, right? So don't have an expectation that your investor is going to sign an NDA. Sure. So the question was, who's signing an NDA? And I made the comment that maybe my employees are signing an NDA, but most of the time investors are not going to sign an NDA. I mean, I just don't. I can't even think on one hand the number of times I've seen an investor sign an NDA. So my point is that more than likely your situation isn't so special that they will sign an NDA. Finally, the investor will basically take the costs associated with the due diligence. You, as the entrepreneur, should not pay for due diligence. That's basically the investor's responsibility. All right. Now, by the way, if anyone has any questions, just yell it out. You don't have to raise your hand, and I'll repeat it, because if I don't, Logan will make sure to remind me. All right. So what are the kind of things that you're trying to figure out during this NDA or during this due diligence process? So these are the kind of things that you might be thinking about in terms of the team. All right. So what kind of credentials do they have? Do they have degrees? Are the degrees relevant? Do they show some level of intelligence? Maybe they do a background check just to make sure there's not something there that they're not aware of. How is their mindset? So do you think they can pull it off? Do they have a positive mindset? Are they capable of being able to execute on this opportunity? Do they have good leadership ability? I mean, listen, if you're founding a startup, the reality is that I think startups are the only enterprises I can think of that in the morning, you're $1 billion opportunity. By noon, you're not going to make it till Friday. And then by the afternoon, you're $1 billion again. And that is a roller coaster ride that in terms of emotional is out of control. So is your leadership style or your ability such that you can actually pull that off? How honest are you? What kind of integrity do you have? Are you smart or are you dumb? I mean, that's just the truth. If you're really dumb, then they're probably not going to be comfortable investing in the business. And you have incredibly good judgment. The problem with starting companies and being a founder or being an entrepreneur is you're always making decisions with incomplete information. Always. Because if it was complete information, there would be no opportunity. Because that company would already exist. So entrepreneurs are working on opportunities or deals that have incomplete information. So based on what little information you have access to, are you capable of making a judgment call and moving forward? And is that judgment call, does the investor think it's a good, you have a good process by which you do that, right? So they're evaluating you based on these and other criteria during this due diligence process. Now, they may not say, hey, can you send me a copy of your diploma, right? They may not say, oh yeah, I did a background check on you, here's what it is. They may not say, what do you think your mindset is, right? But what they're doing is they're taking you to lunch, or they're meeting you at your office, they're listening to your pitch, they're understanding kind of how you operate and making decisions based on that. All right, so next is the business model. We were talking about before, you mentioned the business model. Do you provide value? Do you have a value proposition for your business? What's the distribution look like? And this is actually quite interesting to me because sometimes this is dramatically, in my opinion, overlooked. Oftentimes it's like, yeah, we'll just go get customers. And I'm like, what happens between this and the customers coming in the door? It seems so easy, but ultimately you have to understand that sometimes these channels of distribution or the methodologies in which these products are sold are incredibly complicated. Relationships exist. I've got exclusive rights for the next 10 years, so I can't sell your product. There's all sorts of reasons that you have to weigh. You have all sorts of things that you have to look at in terms of distribution channels. And the better, if you don't understand the distribution channel, which means you don't understand the sales process, then I'm not comfortable investing in your business. Is there differentiation? Mention competition. Is there dramatic differences between us and the competition? I will say in general, if someone comes to me and says, I have a new product or idea and it doesn't exist anywhere in the world, most people are like, wow, that's so cool. My first thought is, there's probably a reason it doesn't exist. Everyone else that did it already failed and you don't even know they existed, right? So you have to convince me that just because no one else has ever done it isn't the reason that it's a good idea. It's because actually someone needs something that they didn't know they needed. And that's pretty hard to do. All right, next, what's the growth strategy look like? Are we going to acquire companies? Or are we going to actually do some sort of roll-up strategy? What's our deal? How are we going to grow this business and how quickly can we grow this business? And do I believe that you can pull it off? Is it a recurring revenue business model? What's the capital requirement for this business? You know, there have been businesses that I've seen that I have no doubt would work, but they might take $100 million to get to scale. And I'm like, my gosh, what's the likelihood that we can get to $100 million in capital in order to get this business to scale? It just seems sometimes to me, the capital requirement is a factor that some people don't weigh in and consider when they're talking about scaling a business. Yeah.
You say 100 million over what time period?
Depends on the business. So let's say, for example, I remember seeing a deal one time, actually it was UNLV company. There was a deal one time that, so this faculty member at UNLV had developed this hydrophobic plastic. So that means it repels water, right? Now think of the applications, medical devices, right? If it can't, most germs are made up of 90+% water. So if the germ can't stick to the medical device because it's made out of this special plastic, big deal, right? But the company that they were working on, the idea was they were actually going to become the plastic manufacturer. And they were going to make these plastics, this hydrophobic plastic, and they were going to provide it in scale and make all of these different products. And I was like, my gosh, we got to build a plant. We got to compete against these other plastic manufacturers, which, by the way, are global multinational companies worth trillions of dollars and blah, blah, blah. I was like, wow, why don't we just start somewhere else, right? So sometimes the capital requirement is fairly significant. The things, and the reality is because the capital requirement oftentimes is that high, that means the cycle is pretty long, and that means the industry may change before we even get there. So I'll say in general, the number of times that I've heard someone say, well, I'm just going to license the technology is infinite. The number of times I've seen someone successfully license the technology is pretty small. Is that this one a possibility? Yes. I think ultimately what they did was they ended up creating a business around the initial 3D printing of prototypes, because it turns out whatever the special characteristics of this plastic did not change if you ran it through a 3D printer. And so their first product to market was, we can build you a hydrophobic prototype. And then if you want to, you can license the tech in the future to build the product yourself. Licensing to me is a cop-out. I hear people say all the time, oh, we're going to license technology. The only people that I see successfully license products are athletes and Walt Disney. And you see their products everywhere, right? So it's hard to license up, I think. Big companies licensing down to small companies, I see a lot. Little bitty companies licensing up, I think is harder. You just don't see it as much. I'll use a really specific example. I was working with this team one time, really cool tech, that basically was originally funded by the DoD. They were able to use this algorithm to analyze social media networks. And because it was funded by the DoD, what the DoD was trying to do was figure out how to identify terrorists online. And how do you connect terrorists who aren't connected to each other in social media? And so they had this really sophisticated algorithm that could look at this social media environment and they could say, oh, these people are terrorists. And so the idea was, oh, there's lots of companies that would want to use this. LinkedIn would want to use it to pair people with people in the industry that they should be connected to, or potential job applicants. People on Facebook would want to be able to use it to recommend friends. And so they scheduled a meeting. We were in San Francisco. They had a meeting with Facebook. I can't even believe they took the meeting, but they did. So we show up, the Facebook guy is there and he's like, yeah, I think it's great. I really appreciate you guys coming. And he said, look, Mahesh, I know you're really smart. I can appreciate how much you've worked on this. We have 300 Maheshes in that room. Just as smart, PhDs, pretty good chance, whatever you've got, we've already thrown in the trash and used something else a long time ago. Right? So that's usually the way the licensing conversation goes when you license up market, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, so what does the deal structure look like? And then finally, what's your exit strategy? Exit strategy is a really weird thing. And the reason I say it's weird is because everybody in the room knows that you have no idea what your exit strategy is. When you're an investor and you're standing up, you're an entrepreneur, you're saying, my exit strategy is acquisition to one of these three companies. No one in the room, including every investor, believes that's what's going to happen. But the irony is, if you don't talk about an exit strategy, then the investor's thinking in the back of their mind, but they actually understand that I want to get my money back out of this deal, right? So you have to talk about exit strategy, even though everyone knows we have no idea what the exit strategy actually looks like, okay? All right. Next are the financial projections. Are they realistic assumptions, right? So if I'm looking at your deal and you've got these projections, are they realistic or not? Now, I will tell you that I know some investors that will look at a deal and they'll say, okay, if it takes them twice as long and the revenue grows at half the rate, is it still a good deal? Because the reality is, in their mind, they think that's what's ultimately going to happen. It's going to take you twice as long and you're going to make half as much money over that same period of time. So realistic expectations, your version of realistic expectations and the investor's version of realistic expectations may not be the same. The 1% market share misnomer, I see that all the time, right? So you say, well, look, if I only get 1% of the market share, then I've got a business, right? The reality is a startup never has enough of two things. You never have enough money and you never have enough people. And the reality is, if you come to me and say, my customer is every American male, then I'm like, probably not. One is you can't market to 170 million people because you don't have enough money or people to do that. And secondly, you're probably going to die before anyone knows who you are. If you come to me and said, my customer is every African-American male between the ages of 18 and 24, I'm like, hot dang, we might be able to market to that group because of social media and everything else. We can focus in on that particular group and identify our first customer. So don't walk in and tell me that if I only need 1% market share, it makes us feel good, right? It's like, oh, we only have to have this much of this big. Well, the reality is you're never going to even identify this big or be able to touch this big to be able to get to the 1%, right? Cash flow timing, meaning what do I need in terms of cash flow? Are you telling me that you're going to run out of money on, ironically, Nick will get this for sure, the number of conversations we've had about companies and the fact that they're going to run out of money on November 1st. What a freaking disaster, right? November 1st is the worst time to run out of money because then you're not going to raise money until January the 30th, right? And so what does the cash flow timing look like in this business? Are there reasonable expenses when you look through the expenses? Realistic revenue growth? Are the market salaries and equity okay, right? So the equity split, does it look right? The salaries, do they look okay for a startup? Am I paying myself $350,000 as a CEO? And the reality is the business is burning 35 or 40,000 a month in cash. Well, it's not rational, right? I should be working under market. The question was, is it a red flag if the key people are not paying themselves? I think it depends on their individual situations. If someone's gone through multiple exits and they're not paying themselves, well, they don't need to pay themselves, right? Because they have plenty of money. If they're starving and their power is going to be cut off tomorrow, it's a problem. Because the truth is that at a minimum, you have to pay your bills, or you can't even focus on the business. And so that's a big red flag, because the reality is the business is, you're going to fall apart, and the business is going to fall apart because you're going to fall apart. All right? So it depends on the situation. What does the cash management look like? Are the margins in the business incredibly slow? Because chances are your projections are off. So if you projected slim margins, that scares me, because that means the reality is it's going to be worse than you think it is. What does the cash management in the business look like? So these are the what else items. So these are the other things that they're considering when they look at your business. What are my general impressions? What's the culture of the business, meaning the other employees, right? You should talk to them. You should have an expectation that if someone's willing to give you an investment, that they might ask to speak to your employees. If you have the expectation going in, you're not caught off guard in the event that they actually want to. All right. If you have some employees, I mean, you're probably going to give them the one that's going to tell them the best, right? I mean, you're probably not going to give them the one that you're about to fire in terms of people to talk to, but have an expectation they might want to talk to your employees. Ask for references, meaning you should be prepared to give them references. If you've raised money in a previous round, you should be prepared for them to ask, are the participants in the previous investment round participating in this round? No, they're not. Is it because they don't believe and this is a sinking ship and they don't want to put more money in a sinking ship? Or is it because they actually don't have access to any dry powder because they've got another deal going on? Why are they not investing? So be prepared to provide references, personal references, or other investor references if there are other investors in this or previous rounds that they might want to talk to. Be prepared to let them ask to talk to customers. You should 100% be prepared to that, especially if they're going to make a fairly substantial investment in your company. Be prepared to allow them to talk to advisors. I would, if I was making an investment, I might call the competitor. Find out how the competitor perceives them. And then finally, what does the valuation look like? Is it crazy? Is it reasonable? What does it look like? All right, so you've gone through the due diligence process with an investor, and that investor is a yes or no, right? They have to make a decision. If the investor has gone through all of this, right? So they've looked at all the warts and they've looked at all the problems. The question is, do they feel like that they still believe in the company, right? And if the idea is yes, they'll probably move forward with the investment. You will 100% will have red flags or things that they're concerned about in your company, in your deal. 100%. Everyone that. There is no perfect deal. The question is, how bad is it or how good is it, right? And that's kind of where they are in terms of whether or not they decide to move forward. Sometimes the question they ask themselves is, do they provide value to you as a startup? Some investors, okay, I'll tell you a couple things. One is most investors like to invest in deals that they feel like that they bring value to the deal. Because they're like, oh yeah, I was the CEO of AT&T for 25 years. I make investments in telecom. And the reason I make investments in telecom is because I know telecom. So I feel like, one, I have a good network for telecom, but also I can pick good winners and losers because I know telecom, right? And so oftentimes they want to bring value to the table and feel like they can bring value to the table.
Hi, Leith.
Yep.
We have a question online. What if you need help getting your startups SAM? This is where I'm currently struggling the most, especially as still currently a pre-revenue business.
But we can definitely send some resources on that.
Okay.
We actually had a full session of the AngelNV Bootcamp that was on this very topic. So we can definitely send some resources to
Okay, so this is
of course, you can
Tony, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, listen, I think that if the question is, okay, so any data that you provide to investors, you need to be very comfortable that it's correct because they're going to analyze the data, right? And so to Tony's point, if I'm struggling to figure it out and I don't have confidence in those numbers, then it's going to be pretty difficult to me to defend that to a group of investors. So make sure you gather enough information that you're comfortable with that. All right. And then finally, and then ultimately, how do they process the deal and move forward? So FundNV has actually a really good due diligence checklist that they use if they're looking at a deal, right? So there's several categories, including team and others, and then they score each one of those. And based on the score, they try to figure out whether or not they want to move forward with that. I would, if I were you and I was preparing for due diligence, I would go through my own company and look at each one of those things and score and figure out where my weaknesses are. And I would shore up my weaknesses so I'm better prepared during that due diligence process. You should know what you're concerned about before you're asked. And you should already have an answer for what those concerns are before they ask the question. And if you're not ready for due diligence. All right. So that's my pitch on due diligence and how you should prepare and what you should do. Now, what questions do you have? Yep. Okay. So the question is, as an investor, how many opportunities could I, in terms of capacity, be working through due diligence on at any one time? And as an entrepreneur, how many potential investors could I work on with the due diligence? I think it probably depends on, as I mentioned before, I don't think any question that you get asked during the due diligence process should be a surprise. There should be no surprises. There are hundreds of templates of due diligence things online, or things that might be asked during due diligence. And you should know the answers to all of those. And more than likely, if your deal room is set up correctly, where you have the information, they may not even ask you those questions because they're all in there, right? And if you've done a really good job, if they do ask the question and you say, if you look at page 4 of the report in our deal room, then they're going to say, oh, okay, I get it. Most of the answers are going to be in that information. So I'm going to do that, right? So if you prepared yourself adequately, from the entrepreneur side, you should be able to have multiple working at the same time, right? But I also think that the reality is some investors, they're not going to work out. And so if for whatever reason you don't want them to invest in your company, then you come up with some reason and then you cut them off and then you just kind of move on, right? Now, from the investor side, it depends on the organization. Right? If it's a single individual, meaning I'm an angel investor and I'm running around town trying to find deals, that's pretty dangerous in my opinion, because dangerous in the sense that, I would hope that I would have a group of people that I try to syndicate deals with, because they send me good deals that they like and I send them good deals that they like. So hopefully by proxy, meaning I trust your experience based on our past experience, I'm willing to look at the deal and might have a few questions, but because you're comfortable with it, then I'm more comfortable with it, right? But it also depends on the organization. If I'm a big angel group, I may have a big due diligence committee. I might see lots of those. I remember one of the general managers at Pasadena Angels told me one time that they had one meeting a month and they let 3 opportunities pitch to their angel group. And every month they saw 100 deals. So the due diligence committee went through and only let 3 pitch, right? And so they probably have a criteria, which is the first wave. If any of these 10 things are true, out, right? And then if we go into deep due diligence, what does our process look like? And that depends on the organization. Good question. Yep. So the question was, based on current conditions, do we see the process looking very different than we did a couple of years ago, right? So that's one of the comments. And then the other question is, can you talk about experiences or talk about the fact that the ease with which you raise money, or the sophistication or the due diligence needs to be more, is probably the right way to put it, now than maybe it was a few years ago. Some of it's based on competition. Competition in the sense that I'm an investor, everything's good, everything's a party, I got to get access to deals. If I ask my company I'm doing due diligence with 800 questions, they're going to be like, I'm out because, oh, by the way, this guy will write me a check and ask me 2 questions. Right? So sometimes there's a balance between the two. And the reality is under current conditions, meaning are some people a little more rigid in the way that they look at deals? I suspect they are. But there are so many personal circumstances in each one of those deals that are somewhat unaccountable. Do I have access to liquidity? Do I need to do something with that liquidity relatively quickly? What's my personal situation? And that may affect how I look at deals too. The other thing is that, like, I know a guy, I was talking to this guy one time, and he had done 200 angel deals. I mean, some of the checks were $25,000, some were $250,000. The guy was just, sometimes he'd just find them on angel list. Yeah, looks good, 25K, right? So to him, 25K wasn't very relevant, but to other people, 25K is a lot of money. So it depends on that situation as well, right? So I think there's a lot of personal circumstance involved in the process and whether or not the process is based on current economic conditions, personal experiences, or something else. So the question was, have we seen angels act differently based on a pending recession or fears of a pending recession? And my answer was, the reality is that people, when they're worried, they do preserve cash. The other thing that's happening is not just from the angel investors, is let's say that I'm a small venture fund and I've got $50 million, $100 million, small fund, and I've made investments in companies, and now I'm worried about those companies surviving the recession because it is harder to raise money. Customers are spending, maybe customers aren't signing up as quickly. So it's going to take me longer to get those companies to market. Then I'll make fewer new investments because I got to make sure the money I have in my bucket is going to keep my existing companies alive, right? So not only is it concern in regards to what I as an individual am going to do and preserve cash, but it's also I'm preserving cash to keep my other children alive, to make sure they don't die in the current environment. Well, sure, but they're totally different, right? So an SBA loan, for example, you're going to have an application you have to fill out. You're going to have to provide a business plan. You're going to have to work with a loan officer. SBA loans, banks only lend money to people who don't need it. And I don't mean they don't need it in the literal sense, right? The reality is that you can easily afford to pay it back. Loans are not at-risk money, right? And so because of that, you're not going to walk in and convince them to give you a loan. If you're really shady, they might not be comfortable giving you a loan. But the reality is, if everything in the box looks good in terms of your matrix, good credit score, good history in this, yeah, okay. You've got enough cash flow to pay the loan? Okay, we're okay, right? So it's a very different process for sure. Whereas this is more like, well, I don't know if it's going to work out, but I'm willing to give it a shot. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this is where you should be empathetic for the especially the angel investor. If you think about an angel investor, let's say I'm an angel investor and next year I decide I'm going to do, and this is what you should never do, but I'm going to do it this way because the math is easy. Let's say I'm an angel investor and I say I'm going to invest $1 million next year, and let's also make the math easy and said I did 10 deals, each deal was $100,000. Okay. The reason an angel investor has to be careful, and the reason they have to expect you to make me a lot of money, is because of the 10 deals I did at 100K a piece, 5 of those companies are going to go out of business. Gone. I put that 500K in the corner and I set it on fire and burned it. Never coming back. They went out of business. Of the 5 companies that are left, 2 become the walking dead. Make enough money to pay the bills, never going to exit, never going to give me buy me out, never going to give me an opportunity to get my money out, which is the worst case scenario, because at least the first 5 I could write it off as a loss. This 200 grand I'm never getting out. Now there's lots of investment groups now that have clauses that allow them ways at least to write off the investment, right? Or be able to sell it at a minimum price just to get out of the deal. Of the 3 deals that are left, 2 of the 3 statistically will return somewhere between 2 to 3 times the original investment, which will hopefully come close to paying for your losses, and maybe 1 will return at 20 times exit. So the reason investors are so concerned is no matter how good you are, I had a student ask me a question one time and they were like, well, why didn't they pick 10 good deals? And I was like, they thought all of them were good deals. They weren't like, oh, this is my bad bucket. This is my good bucket. This is the one that's going to fail. They thought all of them were going to do well, right? And so that's the thing that's the reason investors are cautious, but that's also the reason that you have to provide a compelling reason for them to give you their money. Because the reality is as much as they like you, as much as they like the opportunity, because personal experience, they know 50% chance this company's going out of business. So the question is involved in concerning, do angel investors face the same liquidity pressures to some other organizations, like a fund who's got to invest a certain amount of capital by a certain amount of time, or to close a fund by a certain date in order to raise fund 2 or whatever? I would say angels are probably easily the most flexible, because the reality is that if they have those artificial constraints and they put it on themselves, the reality is most angel investors, they either have access to the capital they can invest or they don't. And as I mentioned before, the worst case scenario is to put yourself in a situation as an investor where you're like, I haven't done a deal all year. I need to do a deal. Well, let's do this one, right? That's the worst case scenario. You have to love it, because still there's a 50% chance it's going out of business. So how often does it happen where a potential investor might refer you to someone else? I'd say often. I mean, on a regular basis, I see someone say, look, for these reasons, you don't fit my investment criteria, but my colleague at XYZ fund does these kind of deals. I'll do an intro, right? Because the reality is that hopefully for that individual, that colleague at XYZ fund is also sending them deals that don't fit their investment strategy, right? Or if it does fit both, then they're calling up and referring you to someone else because they might syndicate deals together. So it happens. For sure it happens. But usually this is the way it happens. Hey, Sally, this is a deal that really doesn't fit our criteria. Take a look at it. If you think you're interested, I'll make an intro, right? More than likely, you're not going to get a blind intro, or you're not going to get an intro or be copied on that first request. And if they are interested, then you get the email that says, hey, I wanted to connect you to so-and-so. This might be a deal cut for them. Good question. So the question is, as a founder, and because you love your opportunity, you love your idea, how do you avoid that being an impediment in the opportunity, right? So listen, I think investors want to see someone who's excited, because the reality is that if you're not excited, when it gets hard, it's going to be rough, right? But also you have to be incredibly careful, because the reality is that, okay, so oftentimes entrepreneurs do not like to hear the counterpoints, because it's negativity or it's whatever. The reality is that every deal has good and bad. Every deal potentially can go one way or another, depending on bad luck you mentioned earlier, or bad timing, or some other things, right? So the reality is there's incredible risk. You should, which is hard to do, but you should want every negative comment, because that opens your eyes to any potential blind spots that you may have. So I don't think passion or being incredibly excited is a negative thing. I don't think it should be perceived as a negative thing. Even from an investor standpoint, I hope you're excited. I want you to be excited, because if you're not, you're going to get killed. But what I do want is I want you to understand the risks and then mitigate those risks. I want you to believe that you can overcome them, but I want you to also prepare in the event that you don't, right? And so that's the way I'd answer that. If you're blindly excited with no concept of the risk or understanding, then that's a problem. So the question is, what's the likelihood of a company being funded pre-revenue? To your comment earlier, sometimes it depends on market conditions, right? So if things are really good and investors are having a hard time getting into certain deals because the deals are closing so fast, that might increase the likelihood they're willing to invest earlier in the cycle of a deal. It also depends on when you're raising money and who you're raising money from. whether or not it's pre-revenue. There are funds that invest in pre-revenue companies. Why? Because they feel like I can get into the deal at a valuation of 1 million or 2 million or 3 million instead of getting in a deal at 10 million that now has 10,000 a month in revenue or whatever the numbers may be, right? And so it 100% exists. There are pre-revenue investors, but also people like to mitigate the risk. And so some like to wait to see revenue before they're willing to invest in the deal. It's hard to talk investors into a deal. They're neither in because it meets their criteria and then they move to due diligence, or it doesn't meet their criteria and you can talk all you want, but I'm probably still not in.
So does an investor want to see all of my verticals, or how many should I present initially? 1, 3, 5, I have 5, but I'm not close to the 5.
Your investor wants to see a strategy to get there.
Oh.
So they want to see, my first product is X. I expect to launch products 2 and 3 in year 3.
Oh, okay.
I expect to launch 4 and 5 in year 5. And based on my cash flow projections and other things, I believe that I can hit these numbers. They don't necessarily want you to say, I'm going to launch all these in year 1, because there's a pretty good chance you don't have resources to do that.
Right.
But they do want to see a pathway if you think you have additional products coming there. You talking about buying the property to open the business, or are you talking about, okay, so restaurants are different than startups.
Right.
The reality is that you can Google what is the valuation of a restaurant, and it will say it's based on the fixtures and X amount of free cash flow. That's all it's worth, right? So the reality is that, then you're looking at things like, are there tax liens? Are there issues with the property? Are there major issues, health code violations? Can I just do an asset purchase, which removes me a liability that may have existed before the business? That's the things you would look at in that situation.
Yeah, it's sold for assets.
Yeah.
It's assets.
Yeah. And that removes a lot of the due diligence, right? Because you're just buying the assets. You're not buying the liability, right? Does the stuff work? And how am I going to finance it? Can I do it with a bank loan, or I do some other way? So the question is, with the recent collapse of FTX and Wilpo Theranos and others in there, there's obviously been a failure of due diligence. Listen, here's the way I look at it. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, and what happens to you is what you're trying to avoid, then you can't really blame anyone, can you? Because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. The other thing that I will say is that in my own personal experience, one is if I don't understand something, oftentimes there's a reason I don't understand it. And sometimes I kind of think, well, maybe I'm just not smart enough to figure it out. But almost always something happens and I'm like, I guess I was smart enough because I didn't understand what the heck was going on there. But the other thing I will say is that there are really smart people that get enamored by certain situations. And one of the biggest human characteristics that put us at most risk is fear of missing out. And so the number of times I've seen investors dive into a deal because so-and-so's in the deal and I'm going to get left out of the deal. So I'm willing to take a shortcut on some of the things I know I should be doing because I want to participate. There's fear I'm going to get left out. Sometimes it works out, but when it fails, it's a disaster. And so if you're ever in a situation, I would never assume that someone has done what they're supposed to do and just participate along with the sheep, because that puts you in a tough situation. Then everyone loses money and then it's a disaster. There was obviously fraud all over the place there. But what happened was some people didn't do the due diligence, or they didn't understand it, or whoever they sent in to do the due diligence came back and said, yeah, it looks good to me. And oh, by the way, Horowitz and others said it looks good too. So I think we're just going to participate. Problem.
The question online is, do you find that investors are more interested in tech businesses instead of brick and mortar?
For sure. It depends on the brick and mortar business. But the reality is, it's, as I mentioned before, what did I say about angel investors? 10 deals, half go out of business. So if I'm going to open a restaurant, unless I'm getting an investor who is a restaurateur, who knows the risk and knows how to help me and do all of those kind of things, pretty good chance that they're not going to get a 20 or 30 times exit out of a restaurant deal. And so why do they like tech deals? Because tech deals can scale incredibly quickly. They can provide a fairly significant return in a relatively short period of time, potentially. It's almost like yes or no. Yes, it worked out. It was great. I've got a few that might fall in between, or no, it was a failure. Whereas brick and mortar deals, the reality is that most traditional investors, okay, maybe I'm a restaurateur, I'm willing to invest in someone I know that used to work for me and they've got a good opportunity and we'll work out some sort of deal on how I'm going to get paid out. But the reality is that the exit isn't significant enough to justify the upfront risk. That's why tech deals are more appealing than brick and mortar deals.
That's all right, everyone. Leith, appreciate you so much.
Yeah, of course.
All right, everyone. Again, we are very happy to have you all here and join us in this first session of the new year and one of our final sessions of the AngelNV Bootcamp. Please join us next week with Craig Macy. Craig will be presenting from Northern Nevada. We will have the room in Las Vegas open. You are all welcome to attend. We will have drinks and then we'll have the presentation online. And we'll see you guys all on Tuesday 10th and then the last pitch day on January 17th.